Good afternoon, and welcome to the weekly Roundup with William Hellmann. I'm your extremely hurried host today, William, and today's podcast is being put together really quickly because I have an appointment this afternoon which I cannot get out of. Well, I guess I spoiled the surprise, too. This is a pre-prepared program. I think you already knew that. Anyway, today's guest is going to be retired Navy commander and member of the Baltimore Central Republican Central Committee, Pete Waters. And he'll be here today to discuss the politicization of the military under Joe Biden's administration, which will be really interesting. Pete's a good friend of mine, and it is sure to be an interesting program because of his outlook. Anyway, the idea of a politicized military is scary. Some would call it a nightmare scenario. I mean, if you want an example of a politicized military, look at the communist China. Their military is under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. Look at Belarus, Russia. Any dictatorship or even slightly totalitarian regime has an army under the control of a political party instead of under the control of its people. And many people didn't believe that would happen with the U.S. military. However, since Biden went and appointed his new head of the Department of Defense, there have been talks of weeding out extremists who wore extremist symbols. What are extremist symbols, you ask? Maybe a MAGA hat. Maybe a little green frog. Certainly not the 3 arrows pointing that way, which are the symbol of the domestic terrorist group Antifa. In any case, we'll get more into this later in the program, but now it's time for our weekly segment you all know and hate. It's time for This Week in the News. On Monday, the Supreme Court announced that it will be hearing a Second Amendment case involving the rights of private gun ownership. The first such case is heard in a little over 10 years. However, this new case will finally put to rest the question, do American citizens have the right to bear arms outside of their own homes? The case, which is New York Rifle and Pistol Association versus Corlett, will specifically tackle this issue, questioning the constitutionality of laws in New York State, which say citizens can only obtain a carry permit if they can cite a reasonable cause for needing one. The case will be argued by Paul Clement, the lawyer behind the 2008 Heller decision and the 2010 Donald v. Chicago decision. Clement was a former U.S. Solicitor General and is considered one of the top Second Amendment litigators in the country. A decision is expected to be issued by at least June 2022. Wow, I wonder if my podcast will still be around by then. Anyway, last Wednesday, a report from Yahoo News revealed that a government agency has been performing surveillance on the social media accounts of American citizens. And no, it's not the NSA, or the CIA, or even the FBI. The spies in question are the United States Postal Service. Yeah, that's really surprising. The surveillance program, which is known as ICOP, real original, was only just made public recently when they had been investigating social media accounts connected to planned right-wing protests, which were scheduled for March 20th. Hey guys, I didn't get the memo on that. Anyway, critics were quick to raise alarm, with some questioning why the United States Postal Service even needs an intelligence-gathering service. Rachel Levinson-Waldman of the Brennan Center for Liberty also pointed out that this unit had been acting outside their stated purpose of investigating potential threats to the United States Postal Service and its employees by investigating completely unrelated demonstrations that had no effect on the Postal Service. These revelations are concerning, especially in light of the current president's involvement with the Obama administration's NSA spying scandal, and bring forward legitimate questions about government overreach. On the bright side, at least I know why my mail keeps coming late. Or not at all. I mean, there's no time to spy and deliver mail, right? Well, last week, people, it was just a crisis. Now it's a full-on disaster. The issue with illegal immigration at the southern border reached a new level of severity this past Thursday, when a judge from Kinney County, Texas, issued an emergency declaration order. The declaration was issued by the Honorable Judge Tully Shahan after law enforcement in Brackettville, Texas, reported being overwhelmed with cases of human trafficking, high-speed chases, and vandalism connected to illegal immigrants who were crossing the southern border. The declaration asks for assistance from outside law enforcement and additionally requests that Governor Greg Abbott deploy the Texas National Guard. In an interview with Breitbart News, local Sheriff Brad Coe said he believes at least 25 more counties will be adopting similar declarations as well. The news came a few days before a Sunday Washington Post ABC poll was released, showing that 53% of Americans disapprove of how Biden is handling the crisis at the border, with only 37% saying they approve of his actions and 10% who are undecided. On Monday, a German court psychologist testified against a Syrian migrant who stabbed a gay couple in Dresden 5 days after being released from German prison, saying that the defendant has no regrets about the crime. The defendant, who German media has referred to as Abdullah al-HH, is a Syrian migrant who was given a short prison term in 2018 after trying to obtain instructions on building a suicide bomber vest. Come on, a short prison sentence. The psychologist said when he interviewed Abdullah in prison, the defendant trivialized his actions that led to his 2018 conviction and didn't see what he had done at the time as a criminal offense. He said he wanted to live according to a strict interpretation of the Quran, and I quote. And he also said that he had a legitimate reason to kill the unbelievers. Despite these statements and a report from the psychologist which concluded Abdullah was dangerous and a threat to German society, the defendant was released on September 29, 2020. 5 days later, he stabbed the victims in this question, referred to as Thomas L. and Oliver L., killing Thomas and leaving Oliver seriously wounded. When he was apprehended after the attack, he is reported to have said he had no regrets about the attack other than that he had not managed to kill Oliver as well as Thomas. It's extremely upsetting. This past Sunday, the Academy Awards ceremony was held in LA's Union Station. But let's be honest, who really cares about the Oscars anymore? What is interesting is that the city of Los Angeles is reported to have cleared out the homeless near Union Station ahead of the awards. Now, the event had already drawn ire as being a proverbial middle finger to the working class of LA who had to cope with the shutdown of a major transit hub ahead of the ceremony. However, the forced relocation of the homeless added a new tone of out-of-touch elitism to the egotistical celebrity circle jerk being held there. One homeless resident named DJ said that last week they were told by city workers that they would have to clear out by next Friday at 6 p.m., and if they didn't, their belongings would be demolished. Real subtle. Now, despite eyewitness testimony from DJ and other homeless residents, LA City Council member Kevin DeLeon lied through his teeth, denying that the city had forced the homeless out for the sake of the award show. DJ, however, offered the following advice to delying in the city of Los Angeles. If you're going to have your award show, don't have it where the homeless people are and you don't have to worry about it. And that has been this week in the news. And boy, what a crazy week it was, people. Anyway, it is time for my guest segment. Again, I want to reintroduce my good friend Pete Waters. He is a retired Navy commander who served between the years of 1989 and 2009. Wow, I was just a thought in my father's head back then when he started. Anyway, he is here today to talk about the politicization of the military. We recorded the interview yesterday evening, actually. And he actually has some good news for us. So let's skip on over to that interview and see what he has to say. Good afternoon, Pete. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Will. How are you?
Doing great. So getting straight into the interview segment here. Obviously, we talked about this when arranging the interview, but today I want to discuss the politicization of the armed forces under the Biden administration. And as a retired Navy officer, commander, I believe, right? I wanted your opinion and your views on this. But before we get to that, though, I wonder if really quickly you'd like to share a little bit about your time in the Navy.
Thanks. I joined the Navy when I was in 1988, when I was in my late 20s, and served for 21 years, got retired in 2009. I did a bunch of interesting things in a few years after that. I'm currently a college professor. So a lot of my experience in what's been going on in the Navy recently is from a distance. I can certainly talk about my time in the Navy from as I said, 88 to 2009. I also need to emphasize that although I'm a retired naval officer, my opinions are my own and they don't represent the government or anything like that. So
Well, that's a given, But the experience was definitely probably extremely interesting.
Joining the Navy in my late 20s was the smartest thing I ever did. So I'm not
Hey,
here to recruit, but I will tell you, it worked out really well for me.
hey, it's not
Flew
too
jets
late.
for 20 years. I went to a number of really cool schools, and everything I've been doing since then has been a result of the training and the not just the flight training as a naval flight officer, but also just the leadership training that I got as a naval officer.
Hey, and I
So
guess that means it's not too late for me then. I'm only turning 21. I mean, 31 next week.
that's true. Some of the services will take you into your late 30s, depending on or mid 30s at least, depending on what you're doing.
Interesting.
So
Anyway, back on topic. So when you were serving, and you were serving during the H.W. Bush, Clinton, and Bush administrations, there was no question of political loyalty back then, was there? They didn't
I
really
never,
ask you who you voted for.
yeah, I never experienced any of that in that era. As I said, I joined right at the end of the Reagan administration. I was in officer candidate school when first President Bush was elected, and then his term, and then the two Clinton terms, and the two George W. Bush terms, and then the first year of the President Obama administration. So yeah, that was um, the idea that the military would have issues with what the National Command Authority or the president or the POTUS or whatever. That was about as far out of your way of looking at things as an alien invasion. It just wasn't something that people thought about. Certainly, we all expected that there were other folks that had political opinions that might be different from ours, but the culture at the time was also, and as far as I know, this is still the case, talking politics inside the confines of your military unit is kind of somewhere between a faux pas and almost a taboo. You just don't do that. It's assumed that not everybody agrees with you, and if you start having a conversation about politics, you're going to run into somebody that disagrees with you, and that's just going to break your unit down.
Oh
So
yeah,
it's just not something you talk. It's not something you talk about on the job, really.
and that's the last thing you want in the field too, is not to be able to
Yeah,
trust your comrades over something silly like, "Oh, you voted for Clinton." Oh,
yeah. Well, that sort of stuff really, didn't come up. I would say that based on my time in the military, certainly at that time, the military was the most politically neutral, and I would also say the least racist part of American society that I've ever encountered. I mean, most colorblind is probably a better way to put it. You know, I
yeah.
flew with, and I will say that when I went in the Navy in the early '90s, that's when they brought women into combat roles, and that was contentious is too strong a word. There were some folks who didn't like it, but I flew with women in the late '90s once they'd gotten in their groove, and they're fine. That's not an issue.
So you
So
served at a really interesting, like I said, you served at an interesting time, and it was an
I
interesting.
did. I served it. I was there when Don't Ask, Don't Tell first came in, and then I was there when they got rid of it, which I was glad to see. It was a crazy policy.
Oh, it
So
absolutely was.
it was a halfway policy, and I understand that it was probably all that they could do at the time. But I've never had any uh, experience where I was concerned that there were homosexual members of the military and that was an issue. Um, I think I've pointed out a few people that I worked with over the years that I realized were kind of in the closet for a while and then came out of it afterwards. And I said, first, I didn't know. Secondly, I didn't care. And third, they did their jobs as well as
Well,
anybody else. So I
exactly. You
didn't.
don't care because it's all about whether or not you can do the job. I mean, if you're
Right.
out in the field of combat, it's
Yeah.
something you don't need to care about. And
Right.
so,
We always said the airplane doesn't know, and the airplane doesn't care. Doesn't care what bathroom you use, and doesn't care, who you look at. So it doesn't matter. It's all about
interest.
performance.
So
And
knowing that though, do you think if there had been attempts like this to politicize the Navy during the Bush administration, the Clinton administration, or the second Bush administration, how do you think that the people you served with would have reacted, just based on who you knew and how well you knew them?
it's really hard to imagine that because we're getting into the alien invasion territory. It's just
Exactly.
so far outside what I would have expected. I
So
remember the squadron I was in the end of '02, when we were getting ready for the 2003 invasion of Iraq. And there was just comments like, well, blah, 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 well, if we go to Iraq next year, da, 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 hey, what do you want to have for lunch? It was just like, okay, that's what they're going to tell us to do. That's what we're going to do. And,
so it's
for
like the
better or worse,
farthest
that's how it worked.
So I take it was like the farthest thing from people's minds and something they wouldn't have wanted to see if it had happened. But it's a nightmare scenario, like you're saying, and one that is so far fetched that it just didn't really, register to people that this could happen.
Yeah, well, I think I have to point out that also I'm not in the military now, and my connections to it are pretty loose. So, how much of the military is getting politicized by the current administration, I can't tell you. I can tell you what I read, opinions of what I read in the paper, but it's all second or third hand.
Well,
But
true.
what I will say is that one thing that I think gets lost by some of the stuff that I read, especially the stuff that you classify as maybe being on the left, is that sometimes I think there are folks who have never been in the military that kind of think of the military as like the robot drone army from Star Wars.
And it's
That
not,
were, yeah, that were a bunch of robots, and that if the the commanders tell us to do something, we'll form ranks and we'll go do it without saying, well, hey, we're not allowed to do that. We'll just follow orders like that. And you see that on the right too. I mean, I see people that are concerned that someone will, some order will come out of Washington and the army will come out and start, grabbing people's guns and all that other stuff. It's like the military is not a monolithic bunch of robots.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
I think the thing that has to be remembered is that every single military member from, the George Washington era up to now, when they make that transition from civilian to military, they raise their hand and they swear to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and not any particular administration or any particular individual.
exactly.
So theoretically, if there was an unconstitutional order given, then it's actually not only their right but their obligation to not do it.
Exactly. And
So
I think the only ones that, some people would be worried about are the higher level, politically appointed ones, like the Secretary of Defense or such a thing. I know recently that they had removed one person who seemed to be a political appointee in charge of an Office of Diversity and Inclusion. And
I
that
think
was
I
where
did
the
see that.
worries
Yeah.
began because
Yeah.
they mentioned wanting to weed out extremists in the military. So
Right.
on that note, I've read before that in conflicts like World War II and Vietnam, that was
Yeah.
especially a time for the military where things like race, religion, and political affiliation became a non-issue because of the heat of battle. And and it sounds like in your experience is that true. But did you ever serve with somebody who might have held extreme ideas, who you saw just radically, they were like a non-issue? Although it does sound like what you said, even if they did, nobody would know because it was faux pas to talk about these things.
Right. Well, I think we have to acknowledge that, through World War II, we still had a segregated military. We had, we didn't have black units. We didn't have African Americans working with, alongside um, the white majority and so on and so forth. But we had the Tuskegee Airmen and so on. So there was an attempt to get that going way before my time. There were serious racial problems in the Navy, particularly. I can't talk about the Army, but I'm more familiar with the Navy situation during Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
Right after Vietnam, in the late '70s, and also during Vietnam, there were gangs on aircraft carriers. There were places on aircraft carriers that white officers simply couldn't go because it was unsafe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we managed to bring all that, get rid of all that by the Reagan administration. Okay, so by the time I joined in the late '80s and the early '90s, I didn't see anything like that at all. I know that any officer enlisted that would have voiced, some bigotry or something like that, the hammer would have dropped on them like, from orbit. So yeah. Now, were there any quote unquote extremists? If they were so well hidden, I didn't see them, and I wouldn't even have thought that they might be there.
Well, yeah, I mean, one would hope too, especially in the heat of battle again. And
Oh
I think
yeah,
I've mentioned this that, such silly concerns would be discarded because the last thing that, you should be concerned about is whether the person is saving you is of the same
yeah,
opinion you are and stuff. You should just be
right.
glad your ass is getting saved.
Yeah, well, there's, at the college where I teach now, we teach about Eugene Bullard, who was the first African American fighter pilot who was actually fought for the French in World War One. And I think the vast majority of the world, or certainly America, doesn't realize that there was actually an African American fighter pilot in World War One. Of course, he was fighting for the French because the Americans wouldn't take him, so that's bad on us. But one of the many books that's been written about him is All Blood Runs Red. So I think that's also a line from the movie Glory with Denzel Washington and Matthew Broderick.
True.
So yeah, you don't care.
Yeah.
You don't care who's on your wing as long as that individual, male or female, can do the job.
Exactly. And, you're right. The U.S. military has had a history, and it was mainly because of the political administrations in place with an issue with actually integrating the stuff. I mean, up until the McKinley administration, apparently, they didn't commission any African American officers above the rank of lieutenant. So, it's definitely worlds away than it was, at least 100 years ago. And that's a good thing, because the military should be the most apolitical body that not only represents Americans, but defends them as well. And it sounds like that's what we've got.
Yeah, the military has to be apolitical. Things get dangerous when it doesn't. I mean, we can just point to places all over the world where we've seen that go wrong.
Mm-hmm. Well then, and in that respect too, as I mentioned earlier, one would probably have to worry about political appointees to the military, which honestly, you have to wonder why that's a thing. But do you think outside of political appointees, do you think that the attempt by the Biden administration to politicize the armed forces will be successful beyond these high-rank political appointees? I mean, do you think enlisted men or officers will start reporting each other to other people in the military, or do you think they're going to rise to the occasion and just close ranks on this and say, we're not going to snitch on each other because somebody's wearing a MAGA hat or somebody's got a Joe Biden sticker or something?
Oh, I can't. We need to also be careful about the premise of the question. Okay. I mean, it's certainly true that in any situation, under any administration, who gets promoted past the general or admiral rank, there's an awful lot of politics involved in that, in the sense that if you want to get even to that point, you've done a tour in DC. Mm-hmm. Does that mean that you're declaring that you're wearing a Democrat or a Republican hat? I can't imagine that that's true. I don't know what happens behind closed doors, but I assume that it's not. Okay. So I'm going to assume, unless I see evidence to the contrary that I've never seen, that the senior admirals and generals are going to support the Constitution over any individual political directive. Okay.
And that's really good to hear.
Yeah. I'm going to assume that that's true unless I see otherwise. As we get lower and lower down into the rank structures, down into colonels and captains and that sort of stuff, then those are the folks that I've dealt with.
Really?
And I can't imagine there being an issue with bringing your politics into what we're doing, what our orders are. Like I said, getting ready to spin up for Iraq, it was a question of, are we going to go to Iraq or not? The question of whether we would not do that or disobey the order was just, it wasn't a question. It was kind of like, I don't know. What do you think? Let's go get lunch. So I don't think that's an issue. And if someone wants to wear a MAGA hat at a home barbecue, I can't imagine that being anyone objecting to that. Now, if you wore a MAGA hat to a command barbecue, Saturday afternoon, that might be an issue. Okay, because and it's not just a MAGA hat. If you wore a Biden hat, the same sort of thing, because that's basically saying we're breaking the rule about, we're not talking about politics, but we're communicating it non-verbally. So you just don't go there. That's the culture that I grew up in. I'm hoping that's the culture that still exists.
I would certainly hope so too, but your perspective is very reassuring on this.
Yeah.
And, that's probably a great thing. I'm glad that, we're hearing this, especially from somebody who's served, that these are the people who are going to defend the Constitution no matter what.
Yeah.
That music, though, in the background means that it's time to go to our next segment, a little game segment called Did They Do It?
Okay.
So basically, I'm going to read off a bunch of, either news items or laws, and it's as simple as figuring out whether they did it. So let me grab a card here for you real quick, and I'm actually going to take score on how many of these you get right. It's the fun of this, you actually get scored on your knowledge. So let's begin. This week, the Biden administration was in the news because apparently they are giving books to the children being detained in migrant centers. The books, however, were written by the vice president and are apparently being paid for by the administration because, well, how else is she going to sell a book anyway?
Right.
Did they do it?
I've heard that that's true. I've also heard, I just heard about this today. It sounds suspiciously familiar to what happened with the mayor of Baltimore this last 2 years ago. So
It does.
Uh,
It makes you wonder why Catherine Pugh didn't give copies of Healthy Holly to the children in the juvenile detention centers here in
well,
Baltimore.
that's kind of out of my lane, but I
Just a
heard
little
that. That was
humor.
true. Yeah.
All right. Next question. A Florida man this week was arrested driving a golf cart through Miami, screaming about Joe Biden probing his brain or something. The interesting thing is the FBI apparently picked him up at the station, and the man hasn't been heard from since. Many say that it was just paranoid delusion, but did they do it?
Well, there's the joke, of course, on the internet about how these things always happen to Florida man. Um,
Ah.
so I hadn't heard anything about that. That sounds a little off the wall. So basically, because the first question I said yes, I'll say no to this one.
And you're right, I did make that up. The Florida man
Okay.
meme is a great one, although
Yep.
there is a good Florida man about a Florida man terrorizing a Florida town with an army of turtles. That happened.
Okay. Okay. There you go.
But you got this one right. Let's go into some laws here. In Frankfort, Kentucky, it is against the law to shoot off a policeman's tie. Specifically, shooting off his tie.
I'm gonna say false on that one.
Actually, it is true. In Frankfort, Kentucky, there's specifically a law that makes it against the law to shoot off a policeman's tie.
It's nice to know that the state legislature of Kentucky is on the game preventing that from happening,
Oh, yeah.
or at least making it illegal. They can't prevent it from happening, but they can make it illegal if it does.
All right, next item. According to the local law in Marshalltown, Iowa, horses are forbidden to eat fire hydrants.
Eat fire hydrants.
To eat fire hydrants.
Forces are.
Horses, yes. Horses are
The
forbidden.
horses are forbidden to eat fire hydrants. Yeah, I'll say that that's true.
It is, which really makes you wonder how many fire hydrants have fallen victim to a hungry horse.
Well, I know that if I get reincarnated as fire hydrant, I definitely want to move to that town in Iowa because I'll be safe from being, from the horse predators. Yeah.
Okay. In Seattle, Washington, it is illegal to carry a concealed weapon that is over 6 feet in length.
They have open carry I believe they have open carry in Washington.
Seattle?
Over 6 feet in length. Did you say a concealed weapon that was over 6 feet in length?
Yes.
I want to say that's false because I can't imagine even the dumbest legislature assuming that I can conceal a weapon that's over 6 feet in length.
Well, unfortunately, the people in Seattle are that dumb. It is true.
Okay.
Okay, we got one more for you.
Yeah.
It's illegal to drive more than 2,000 sheep down Hollywood Boulevard at any time.
That's definitely illegal.
And you're correct, although I wonder why LA County decided it was they needed that specific law to prevent a sheep drive down Hollywood Boulevard.
People forget that until the 1930s, Southern California was extremely rural. And what made the difference was when the movie industry got started in the 10s and 20s, the film was so primitive by compared to what we have now. You needed very bright light to film anything. And those movie lights didn't exist. So if you look at movies that were made around 1910, if there's a scene in a living room, it was actually filmed in a parking lot because they just set the thing up outside. And the reason they did it in California is because it never rained.
So the last thing you want is a rabid sheep eating your set.
Exactly. So, but also since it was so agricultural, I could see that there could be a law in the books about that. I know up until recently, New York City, I think, I read this 10 or 15 years ago, did a scrub of removing out-of-date laws. They actually went back and got some of these things off. One of which was reporters were specifically prevented, or it was illegal for them to tie their horses up in front of City Hall prior to a press conference. So they got rid of that rule in about the late 80s, mid 90s, something like that. So yeah, crazy laws hang around on the books for many years.
It does kind of make me want to teach them a lesson by tying up my horse in front of New York City Hall.
Yeah, that would be an interesting act of civil disobedience.
Really would be. Well, it was great having you on, Pete, and I think my listeners are going to be really reassured by what you have to say.
Sure. There are things I worry about. That ain't one of them.
And that's a good thing, An apolitical military is the one thing we definitely want, neither
Yeah.
side to be running it.
Yeah. I think another thing that needs to be borne in mind, and I have no idea how this would work, and I'm assuming we're never going to find out, but bear in mind, you've also got all the National Guards
Ooh, yes, yes.
that, on paper at least, the way they're structured, they answer to their governors. Now, the president can go click, and I'm nationalizing the National Guard, and that's been done. It was done during the Civil Rights era and stuff like that. But you got all these National Guard units that actually are not only sworn to protect the Constitution of the United States, but the Constitution of the state of whatever. So
that could be an interesting scenario where you've got
you could
National
write a
Guards
novel.
going rogue.
You could write a novel, assume all the worst case that happens at one level, and assume all the heroes are at the other level. And how realistic would that be? I don't know, but
would make an
the
interesting.
military is not monolithic. I think that's the big thing I want to come away with. The military is not General Grievous drone army. Okay, so they're human beings. We're human beings.
That's a good thought to close on. Thanks again, Pete.
All right, take it easy, Will.
Well, that was a great interview. And what Pete said, and I just want to reiterate, Pete is a retired Navy commander, and everything is his personal opinion, but it's reassuring, and it actually confirms what I believe. As he said, the military is not General Grievous's drone army. For those of you who don't get it, that's a Star Wars reference. But these are your neighbors, these are your friends, these are your family, even. I had a cousin who almost got into the military, and so it's a thing where people like Biden can politicize the upper echelon of the military all they want. They can have all the inclusivity officers they want, but things like politics, it's taboo in the military. Their one job is to keep us safe from all enemies, both foreign and domestic. And honestly, they don't really have to worry about the domestic part that often. That's what the National Guard's for. So it really is, like Pete said, the most apolitical body in the country, except for, of course, when you get up to those upper echelons. And we don't have to worry about it getting overly politicized. Because no matter who's in charge, whether it's the most far-right or far-left politician, these people have sworn an oath to protect the country, to protect the Constitution, and they're not about to go back on that. It's very reassuring. It's just really great to hear that, too, and have that confirmed. But anyway, this next week, you should take some time out of your day, and if you see a soldier on the street or something, just go up and say thanks. Thanks for being a completely unbiased protector of this country. Anyway, that is it for this week's show. Really quickly, because I forgot to read out his score, Pete's score was 4 out of 6. He got 4 out of 6 right in Did They Do It, which seems to be the average score because I am extremely tricky. But seriously, horses eating fire hydrants, who would have thought? Anyway, this has been the Weekly Roundup with William Hellmann, and as your host, I want to say have a great week. Go out there and thank your extremely apolitical military servicemen. There are no extremists there. Let's be frank. Extremists are the kind of cowards who aren't going to put their lives on the line for this nation. Anyway, have a wonderful week.